Okay. I'm going to skip to this slide and say to start that, the UN Secretary General in the run-up to the Glasgow meeting of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change spoke of the world being on a catastrophic pathway. And the question for natural scientists and climate modelers then is one about how to understand exactly how many reductions we need, what the impacts of climate change will be, and how to reduce those. Social scientists have a more subtle question, and from the political science perspective particularly, we seek to understand how it is that policies can be generated to help reduce emissions. And so, this question about setting up effective policies is preceded by an earlier question, which is how do we even measure what constitutes an effective climate policy? The modelers have done a good job of sort of predicting the course of climate change by the end of the 21st century, given where we are in terms of emissions that have been reduced and emissions pledge reductions made, such as here, Climate Action Tracker. But there's a question for the political sphere, which is, there's a couple of broad theoretical explanations. One of them is sort of the tragedy of the commons, that, in the tradition of Ostrom and others, there's the idea that perhaps there's a global commons and that the United Nations perhaps is at the center of the effort to regulate that global commons, but that it hasn't happened all that effectively. If we look at, the latest instance of being the Paris Agreement and some of its perhaps failures to fully implement emissions reductions to the degree that we need. I don't think anyone will argue with the idea that we are on a pathway that may be catastrophic. So the question is, does this tragedy of the commons approach work? If not, maybe there's a domestic interest group of possibility for explaining the lack of domestic climate policies. And so I think we're sort of with the new approach, although we're not denying the role of the international community and the United Nations, but the prior question of how do we even measure policy stringency and who should step up to help solve this problem has multiple causes, right? Part of it is certainly international, part of it is certainly domestic. But the domestic policy level is the one where national governments are responsible for implementing policies that are designated even by the United Nations. And the United Nations has recognized this in the Paris Agreement with the construction of the NDCs as the building blocks of climate policy, the NDCs being nationally determined contributions, those that are put forth by domestic governments for what they will do, okay? So we seek to take this whole question of international versus domestic perhaps a little bit further. We seek to speak to, how do we establish domestic policies that will in fact be useful and effective with a sufficient level of ambition or stringency within the context of this disjuncture that it seems to exist, and we're going to test this, between higher climate policy ambitions overall year by year as those get ratcheted up, and lower domestic policy execution, because the outward-looking or international policies let nations show that they are addressing climate change, whereas those who must really implement those changes at the domestic level are not equipped to do that. They don't perhaps have the political will or the resources. So we construct systematic indexes to measure climate policy stringency across 181 countries at the domestic and international levels, and then test the causes of these policies. We document the inconsistency between domestic and international policies, and we test this first after constructing these indexes for domestic policy and for international policy. We test the effects of these policies and some other variables, such as fossil fuel subsidies, which turn out to be also very important. but we test these on the effect they have on emissions levels at the national level. We will conclude that an emphasis on the NDCs as ends unto themselves, rather than just as a means to enacting the broader but still inadequate Paris Agreement regime, is really much more necessary, that a much greater focus has to be put at the domestic level. I mean, this isn't a new admonition, but it is a new empirical way to measure it and a demonstration of how this is the case. Okay, so that is really the sum of our contribution, which is to measure both the domestic and international policies and demonstrate how, in fact, international policy is significant in considering overall emissions, but domestic policy really not so much. Okay, so we proceed by discussing the construction of our indexes. Then we talk about the statistical analysis, and we test the role of, the correlates of policy, and we look at the role of international policy in generating domestic policy. Okay, so I think I'll proceed. We don't have a huge amount of time. Just conceptually saying that, how do we construct a domestic policy index? We tick 3 items. One is, does the country put a price on carbon? Is the country joining a group making a pledge to have net zero emissions by 2050? Is the country pledging concrete emissions reductions objectives in their NDC, or just making general claims? We talk about an international index, the international index is based on whether a country signed the key agreements, international agreements of the United Nations before the Paris Agreement. That is the prior, the UNFCCC, the 1992 Rio Accord, the Kyoto Agreement, and the Montreal Protocol, right? We talk about whether a country signed those and when. The assumption being that countries that sign early are leaders with stronger international policy, and those that sign later are laggards. I think I will turn it over now to Jennifer, who will take us through a little bit more of the statistical analysis.
Can I get the next slide?
Oh, sorry.
So for the first model we ran was on the 2018 greenhouse gas emissions. We ran a basic model, a model with a full sample, and then we subsetted that sample to just the top emitters. And from these results, we can see that international ambition was significant in 2 of the models with the full sample and the top emitters, and then it was negative. So this generally means that as ambition increases, emissions decrease. A similar relationship was seen with government budget size, but only in the full sample, and with a much lower coefficient. Oil rents were also significant. So as oil rents increase, greenhouse gas emissions decrease. The probably most important covariate in these models were the explicit fossil fuel subsidies, with this covariate being significant in all of the models and being positively associated with greenhouse gas emissions. So as fossil fuel subsidies increase, so do greenhouse gas emissions. Can I get the next slide? Thank you. So we ran a new model with international ambition as a dependent variable in order to try to get a sense of what we could attribute to the contribution of international ambition. So for these models, domestic ambition was only significant in the basic model, And once we added all the other covariates, the significance disappeared. Oil rents were once again significant and negative. So as oil rents increased, international ambition decreased. For the top emitters, domestic ambition was also significant, but at a much lower level. So we ran a similar model, but for domestic ambition, where we see that the most important covariate in these models was clientelism, with it being negative. So as clientelism increases, domestic ambition decreases. We see other covariates that are significant in these models, but at much lower levels or with lower coefficients, such as government budget size, oil rents, and fossil fuel subsidies. But fossil fuel subsidies were only significant within the top emitters. And then Todd, you want to explain the construction of the cases?
So in addition to the statistical analysis using greenhouse gas total emissions as a dependent variable, and also using the policy outcomes as the dependent variable, we grouped countries into some of the important groupings within the United Nations. I don't know if we have time to elaborate on this too much, except to say that, you know, Group A was based on having low domestic policy and low international policy scores. Group B was based on domestic low, international high. And, you know, the important sets of cases were really for emissions, that is, 54% of global emissions in cell B. The other most important group was that which had domestic high and international high, which is cell D, which was about 16% of global emissions. So in cell B, we had a lot of the Kyoto non-Annex 1 countries, China and India, as well as a range of others. Cell D, we had the European Union members and other sort of very, model emitters. Cell C was a small set of outliers. Unfortunately for us, being in the US, that included the United States. Cell A was a lot of countries with low-income countries, and some of them were conflictive countries. And cell A and cell C represented lower proportions of the total sample. If we look at A and D, we see that fossil fuel subsidies are really the most important cause of GHG emissions in 2018 among both of these groups. In fact, all three of the groups that we ran analysis on. And that international ambition, in other words, leading with the international, was also important for the case A groups, which are the small countries and some of the conflictive countries. Okay, so in other words, some of the trends that we found hold up stronger than others when we break the nations into by domestic high, international high, et cetera. So, the results of the partial models, I think we're still going to be processing. We've done another set of runs, and we have slightly different results with more contemporary data, but we're going to include that in the final version of the paper. Sorry, back to you, Jennifer. Or shall I take over? Just to conclude very quickly, since we're out of time, unless Jennifer wants to chime in. Is that okay? Or do you?
Yeah, that's fine. You can finish up.
All right. So just to say quickly that our conclusion is that while nations lead with their international policy, and that policy is viewed as a correlate of domestic policy, that is how they behaved internationally in the signing of prior agreements, does affect their domestic policy stringency. The other important factor that affects domestic policy stringency is fossil fuel subsidies. And we use only explicit fossil fuel subsidies as defined by the International Monetary Fund, which now publishes nation by nation fossil fuel subsidy amounts. So those were important, as were a few of our other control variables, which we can discuss a little more in the Q&A. I think that what this shows overall is a shift to the importance of considering, domestic interests, such as those that would generate domestic policy or block stringent domestic policy, and those that would create fossil fuel subsidies, i.e. the fossil fuel industry and its allies, may be where we need to look in part for the blockage of effective domestic climate change policies. I think we should leave it there, but I apologize. And if Jennifer wants to chime in about anything, that would be great. If not, we can open up the floor for questions.